I actually try to comfort myself at times by saying to myself, well, we have gone through periods of real government repression and a really divided populace and so on, and we've gotten through it. But the difference now, and this is why it doesn't comfort me that much, because then I always get depressed again when I think about the differences today. The government's surveillance capabilities today are undreamt of by the framers. They would have been undreamt of, until the last few decades. The government's sort of unique ability to exercise coercive control in a variety of ways and to punish in a variety of ways is really unprecedented. And this is one of the many ironies, right? And we saw this tension between Trump and Elon Musk. The tension between we should have a small government. The government's in everybody's business. We need to get it out, which of course is a strand of traditional, sort of libertarian strand of traditional conservatism, versus the flat out totalitarian impulse of, no, the purpose of government is to control people, to prevent them from doing things that you don't want them to do, to help you make money, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the tools now that a repressive government has at its disposal, and that this particular government has shown an enthusiasm for using, those are really unprecedented, and that's mostly due to technological changes.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it's in the news today, right? President Trump today, we're recording this on a Friday, spoke to President Xi or Xi of China, and they were talking, among other things, about the TikTok deal. And there was a lot of pressure, and there was actually congressional action to say that TikTok had to divest its U.S. assets because it would get a lot of data on Americans that could go to the Chinese and be abused. Since then, since that debate, we've seen, of course, Elon Musk take over X, and we know Elon, is all for abusing data and has some very strange leanings. And we have Donald Trump now trying to engineer, apparently, a takeover of TikTok by two very staunch Trump supporters, Larry Ellison and Mark Andreessen, which will make it a right-wing data gathering mechanism, not just a right-wing media mechanism. And we know that they can abuse that data in ways that the Chinese never could, that they have ways of using it against Americans in ways that Chinese never could. That poses another set of problems that we've never encountered before.
Yeah, yeah, right. And my strong advice to young people, which none of them take, of course, is get off social media.
Surely your daughters listen
Yes,
to you and do exactly what you say.
they go, "Oh, mom." But yeah, my unheeded advice is, you do not need to be on TikTok. You do not need to be on Instagram. You do not need to be, and don't do it, because these really are already surveillance platforms. But up until now, they've largely been surveillance platforms for the purposes of selling you stuff that you don't need. But they are in the process of, I think, there's a real danger they get turned into surveillance platforms in the interest of political control.
So going back to your day job, obviously as all this happened and I'm like writing about it, I go back and I read the First Amendment for the 5,000th time. And I think of how Trump is viewing it and how Trump's lawyers are viewing it. And, one of the things that the way the First Amendment is written is it says Congress shall make no laws that
Didn't say
abridge,
anything
et
about what
cetera.
the president can't do, does it now?
No,
I'm
it
sure
doesn't.
that's what Trump's thinking to himself. He's thinking, it doesn't say president, doesn't
Well,
say Donald Trump will
isn't
make
that
no.
well? Is it? I mean, there's a question there, right? There's an intent. Um, and back in the olden days, during the first bout of this, during the Alien and Sedition Acts, you happened to have around Thomas Jefferson at the time, and he was like, "No, this is what we said you shouldn't do." But we don't have that anymore. And you've got people who are saying, well, if the administration uses its rightful FCC power, or its rightful power regarding the administration of grants, or its right, then that it doesn't even enter the realm of what's covered in this amendment. And I'm just wondering how you view that.
So I hate to tell you, but your understanding of me as some kind of First Amendment scholar is extremely misguided. I am not a First Amendment scholar, so I hesitate to say a whole lot. But it is true that the government.
Well, you
So on
teach
the one hand,
constitutional law, and the First
occasionally, but
Amendment's in the Constitution.
I, 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 you know this from your brief experience in law school, David. The constitutional law often consists of all the really boring parts, like the Commerce Clause and so on. And that's. I don't teach constitutional law course that covers individual rights. So so that being said, I don't want to go out on a limb and have all my colleagues say, "I can't believe you said that," because you don't know what you're talking about, which is basically true when we get beyond the basics on this stuff. Um, on the one hand, the government obviously is entitled to encourage certain kinds of things and does it all the time in a non-controversial way. That the government can decide, we want to give grants to people in the health sciences and not in this other area because we think this is more important. And that happens all the time, and nobody cares one way or the other, or you care if you're not getting a grant. But so up to a point, the government does all the time, routinely and uncontroversially, try to encourage certain forms of behavior, discourage other forms of behavior. That said, traditionally, when it comes to grant making, when it comes to broadcast licensing, a variety of legal doctrines have been created by the courts that essentially say, yeah, but you can't just single out, you can't deprive one group of benefits that you're giving to everybody else if you're depriving one group based on something that the Constitution also protects, right? Like the exercise of free speech or free religion, or you can't decide you're going to give benefits to only to white people, etc. And then you get into these very complicated issues of proof. I Even the situation with Jimmy Kimmel, right, and the remarks by the head of the FCC. Of course, his argument, and I don't know if anybody's actually going to challenge this in court, right? Because it doesn't look like Disney wants to. I don't know if Jimmy Kimmel wants to or something, but you know, he didn't say he was going to yank their broadcast license. It was more of the nature of "will no one rid me of this troublesome priest" kind of remark. Does it have a chilling effect? Would a court find that to be in and of itself government action to yank a license in a manner that interfered with the extra, protected speech? I don't know. I don't know. Um, it's just a little bit ambiguous, and I also just don't know enough about the legal doctrine here to say a whole lot more than that. But I also think, and you've heard me say this many times, I also think that we get too focused on what's legal, what's illegal, what's constitutional, what's not constitutional, and and which in turn leads us to be a little too focused on the courts and litigation as an avenue for addressing things like this. And I think the bigger, broader conversation, as you know, is not, is this legal or illegal? Is this constitutional or not? Especially, is this constitutional or not, given all the structural issues with our Constitution? But is this a good thing for the kind of society we want to live in? The answer to that one is like, no, of course not. Of course not. It's a terrible thing. I don't really care if a court says, well, it's legal. Even if that court is made up of, Democratic judges, an idea that I reject anyway, right? Even if they say, well, for 50 years, this would still have been legal under our doctrine, under existing doctrine, maybe, I don't know. But the impact of all of this is terrible. And we should instead be having a conversation that is about what kind of society do we want to live in? What role do we want free speech to have in our society? And not so much a conversation about, well, does this or does this not infringe on the First Amendment in a way that a court is going to uphold?
Yeah, and I think it's just a final point here because I know we've got to wrap up. There's a legal way of looking at it. There's a human way of looking at it, which you just talked about. And then the political scientists who I don't really usually have much time for will weigh in. And in this case, they'll make an important point, which is that the way Trump is governing is as an authoritarian. and that is inconsistent with the system that we thought we had going here. But one of the things that's worrisome about it is not the constitutional legal uh, issues specifically, but that there is this shift going on, and you have a president who's running on an autocratic or an authoritarian approach to government, and that
Yeah.
as that continues, more freedoms, more liberties will go away, more protections will go away, and the underlying sort of sort of the underlying sort of philosophical foundations of our government will be destroyed in the process.
I think it's, I think it's worth thinking about this as like the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The framers of the Declaration of Independence were starting from scratch in a sense, right? They had to start from scratch because what they were doing was breaking the law under the terms of, King George III. Um, they were British citizens, and they were saying we don't want to be British citizens anymore. And the Declaration of Independence famously appeals to some idea of natural law, the idea that there are rights that are inalienable, as the document puts it. And then there's you can they say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but you can sort of suss out what else they thought were inalienable rights when you read their bill of particulars of like why they're mad at King George. It's a whole long list of he's done this, he's done that, and that's why we have to become our own independent republic. Um, they're not starting with the law as it was. They're starting with first principles. What kind of society do we want to live in? And why do we think that's justified or right and okay? The Constitution is a process document. And what it has become over time, it's become a form of, it's like Talmudic studies, right? That if you take away our kind of standard American assumptions of, well, the Constitution, you say, well, would it be a good idea for a society to take a short document that was written, almost 250 years ago by a very small group of people with a particular set of perspectives and use that document to try to solve all their pressing policy problems? You'd be like, well, no, that seems kind of bonkers, right? Why would you do that? Especially a document that is quite hard to amend over time, much harder than Thomas Jefferson would have wanted for sure. That constitutional laws become a form of theology, right? It's not even really law. A lot of our other democratic countries around the world think we're pretty weird in our constitutional doctrine. And I think that this is a moment where it is useful for people to stop asking themselves the question, well, is it constitutional? Because that's not just a question, well, read the First Amendment. What does it say? It's a question of, well, what are the last, 200 plus years of court opinions on this? Et cetera, combined with statutes interpreting this, which is going to give us an answer, but maybe it's not necessarily an answer that's particularly useful for thinking about that set of questions of, well, wait, what kind of society is the United States of America? What kind of society was it supposed to be? What kind of society do we now today in the year 2025 as opposed to the year 1776 or 1787 or 1789? What kind of society do we in 2025 want it to be? And I think for sure on any measure, we have gotten very, very, very far away, either from the more utopian visions of the framers, and I think from any America that most Americans, including most people who voted for Donald Trump, actually want to live in.